Okay. Hopefully, we'll be joined by a few stragglers as we go along. But good evening to everyone, and thank you for coming to listen to Dr. Bob Gill. I'm going to hand straight over to Bob. I know Bob's reputation probably precedes him, and I'm not going to spend ages talking about that. So if I can hand straight over to Bob, he's going to give us a sort of background introduction to what's been going on. To you, Bob.
Thank you. So thanks for inviting me to speak to you. My main aim for tonight is to get across how imminent the potentially irreversible capture of NHS control by American corporations is. And in order to understand that, it's important to have a bit of background as to how we got to where we are. So there's been a almost seamless 4-decade-long stealth, complex privatisation agenda of the NHS. No government would dare to do this as a big one-off privatisation, such as we saw with the utilities, because there would be a national outcry. So they've done this by stealth, and the blueprint was written by Oliver Letwin and John Redwood in 1988, called Britain's Biggest Enterprise, and it set out how we'd go from a publicly funded, publicly provided service to an American-style insurance-based system. And we've carried out most of those steps, and what the NHS Bill currently before Parliament will do is hand over total control of the budgets to chiefly one company, United Health, America's biggest private insurance company. So the steps taken so far, well, we've had a piecemeal asset grab underway, a slow motion asset grab. And part of that has been to, first of all, disempower the health professionals within the NHS, insert a bloated bureaucracy at the top, replace the public service ethos with a business ethos, normalize marketization by using a fake narrative of how competition improves efficiency, which we all know it doesn't, by the running of an internal market. And the internal market requires a huge cost diversion away from providing care into running the bureaucracy. So this was done in the 80s, started in the 80s, in the 90s, reinforced in the early 2000s. And over that time, we've seen the outsourcing of ancillary services. And then for the first time, with the Concordat with the private sector, clinical services in 2000, whereby our friends in the private sector were going to help us clear backlogs out of the goodness of their heart, and were brought into the NHS fold. In terms of assets, we can break these down into 3 main assets. You have the land and the property. They needed a mechanism to privatize all those assets, and that mechanism was private finance initiative, whereby older inner city hospitals were closed and replaced by smaller out-of-town hospitals, typically with 30% less bed capacity. So although we saw PFI-driven massive hospital rebuilding program, we also, along with that, saw a massive bed closure program, a covert bed closure program, by replacing facilities with smaller facilities. PFI also transfers the ownership out of the public sector. So these PFI-built hospitals aren't owned by the public sector and never will be owned by the public sector. We just have the honor of paying a average 30-year mortgage on a loan, at the end of which we still don't own the asset. Now, hopefully most of you would never get a mortgage on a house under those terms where you just pay for the servicing the loan and never own it. So PFI, 11 billion borrowed and potentially 88 billion to be paid back without owning anything at the end. So that's a financial instrument used to pull away the land and the property. The market bureaucracy necessary for the internal market was up and running, ready for full externalization of this market under the Health and Social Care Act 2012. So that really accelerated the process, forcing the tendering out of all hospital services and using these new groups called clinical commissioning groups as a front led by GPs, entrepreneurial GPs, as a cover for actually a process that they had very little influence over. And the people controlling that process were actually put in place in the mid-2000s under something called a framework for external support of commissioning. So 2006, under New Labour, we had this steamrollering of commissioning, still following the market ideology of competition increases efficiency. And this framework integrated private companies into the running and the budgeting and the financing. The backroom function of the NHS was handed over to private companies. Private companies, including United Health, McKesson, which is a big American IT firm, and the big four accountancy firms like KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers. So these companies have been working quietly behind the scenes for a good 15 years in preparation for the NHS Bill. In fact, what the NHS Bill does, it makes legal what has been going on for over a decade. But most people haven't realized. One part of the 2012 Act, which wasn't published at the time of the Act, but came in later on using a parliamentary, what's called a statutory instrument, came out in the following year, 2013, in April, which was the engine to make the compulsory outsourcing take place. And this was called Section 75. Now, the reason I make a point of mentioning that is because the government is claiming somehow that the repeal of this Section 75 is a stepping away from privatisation. And I will explain to you why that is absolutely not the case shortly. So we now have we're entering the pandemic, 2019, with an NHS that has been starved of resource for a decade, had a budget rise around 1%, where the historical average was 4%. So in fact, a real terms shrinkage over that time. You had the staff effectively having a 20 to 30% pay cut over that decade, leading to massive recruitment retention problem and huge vacancies, 40,000 nurses, 10,000 doctors. And since the financial crash, 2008, we lost 38,000 acute hospital beds. And the waiting list for the NHS was approaching 5 million. So the NHS was in a very, very bad state as we entered the pandemic. Part of the 2012 Act decimated public health provision. So they closed the labs, they sold off the assets, and they undertook a compulsory redundancy scheme, extracting all the organizational memory and expertise out of public health and transferring control of public health to local councils and removing the necessity to have a medically qualified head of public health. So you had a shrinkage and a downgrading of the status of public health. So we had the pandemic. And what did the pandemic see? The pandemic saw government use this as an opportunity for profiteering on what I think was a monumental scale They ignored basic public health. They let the virus run wild and belatedly had a response which was totally private, whereby we know that the Serco Deloitte Test and Trace system, which has spent 22 billion, according to a parliamentary committee, failed to prevent the spread of the virus or the necessity for economically devastating lockdowns. So money totally down the drain. Now, the problem with spending money in that way, it's an opportunity cost. That money could have been spent in rebuilding public health, rebuilding the NHS, and funding local council services, but that wasn't done. And there's not a day that goes by that we're learning more about how corrupt these massive contracts were, how they were awarded without any open tendering, often done by private email among senior politicians and people in the private sector, often with connections to the Conservative Party. In fact, there was a VIP lane run by the Cabinet Office in terms of awarding contracts, and you had a 10 times greater chance of having a contract if you had links to the Tory party. So this is pretty blatant corruption now, which the government can get away with given their 80 MP majority and a totally docile media. Now, what we are being told, we had publishing of the white paper in February of this year, was that the government is using the pandemic to learn some key lessons. The problem is all the lessons they're learning is to continue the profiteering and the destruction of public service. So the pandemic has provided cover for what Naomi Klein wrote about, which is disaster capitalism. It is shamelessly exploiting the fact that people, certainly within the NHS, are busy trying to survive and to make the system function. And it's using unchallenged media reporting of their press releases to hoodwink the public into something that they really have no grasp of how bad this is going to be. So let's come to the NHS Bill. The NHS Bill seeks to do 2 or 3 major things. The first page of the bill states that the NHS will no longer be a provider of services. Now that's pretty big news. The NHS in effect becomes a funding stream to be run by, contracted out, and controlled by the private sector. Now, remember I told you about the framework for commissioning set up in 2006. It's these same companies that have been working behind the scenes that will be controlling NHS budgets. The other thing the bill does, it creates these new bodies, new legal entities, and the latest acronym is ICS, or Integrated Care System. But this is very cleverly devised and disarming language. There's nothing integrated about the integrated care system. In fact, there's not much care about the integrated care system. What it is another name for managed care. Managed care is what the American system is run on. That's the basis of the American system. And I'm talking about Medicare, Medicaid, which is government-funded care for those people who are rejected by private insurance, i.e. the elderly who have limited incomes but have a lot of illness, the poor and the young. So what in America is market failure, the state has to step in to provide some funding. Over the years in America, what was predominantly not only funded by the public sector, but also provided by public hospitals, well, the private sector has stepped in. And one of the big movers and shakers in taking control of Medicare in America, taking care of the funds, was our very own Simon Stevens, the outgoing head of NHS England, who returned to the NHS after a decade-long stint at United Health. In fact, he was president of United Health's Global Expansion Division before he returned to the NHS. And in the early 2000s, he was a chief advocate of outsourcing clinical services with the NHS plan. So he did some privatization work in the early 2000s, went off to America to make sure that they didn't go for a public option, i.e. state funds everything, privately provided, but state funded universal healthcare. He campaigned against that. And he also campaigned to allow United Health to gain control of public funds through Medicare and Medicaid. So what the bill does, in effect, it creates Medicare in the UK, whereby the state funds what is privately provided and privately managed. And the money that's going to be managed will be managed chiefly by United Health. So that's the main threat of the bill is no longer will the NHS be a provider. These integrated care systems will have a lot of autonomy. They will be dominated by these companies that have been in the background for years. And those supposedly NHS leaders who are there to, in theory, represent our interests, well, many of those have gone through the revolving door and in a previous life were working for the private sector. So in effect, you have boards dominated by the private sector and people wearing an NHS badge who came from the private sector. And they have one goal, and that one goal is to use the integrated care budget. There'll be 42 of these organizations across the country, effectively breaking up, denationalizing the NHS, and they will have autonomy to decide what services to provide. So the NHS ceases to be universal, and each ICS will be able to decide their own option for what services to cut. For example, cataract surgery or joint replacement surgery or fertility treatments can be totally banned in an ICS, a population of 2 to 3 million people. The ICS board will decide that, but they will also decide on an individual level based on your patient records, based on your risk stratification, whether they deem it worthy for you to have a treatment or an operation. So the bill removes the power your GP or your consultant had on paper to push and advocate for your treatment. That's being removed and it's being automated. And who's in charge of that process? American private insurance companies. Now, if you know anything about how they make money, the way they maximize income is through the denial of care. So making sure expensive operations aren't done and making sure very sick people don't step foot in a hospital where there's a risk of them receiving expensive treatment. How do you stop them getting into hospital? Well, the most blatant way is to close your hospital down, sell off the land. The extremely ill will have longer journeys to get to hospital. Every minute spent traveling to hospital in an acute situation increases your chance of death. So a dead patient is a cheap patient, won't cost anything to treat. They're also introducing a system of filtering access to A&E. So you won't be able to turn up by your own means to A&E. You have to ring up 111 first, a new service which will decide whether you're eligible to go to A&E or you'll be otherwise directed to a downgraded facility, such as an urgent care center, where they don't have senior medical staff to back up and support junior staff to make the right decision. So what I'm painting here is not some theoretical dystopia. It is a system that works in America where thousands of people are allowed to die preventably every year. And these companies are allowed to make exorbitant profit. And the CEO is able to pay themselves multi-billion packages, and the shareholders do very well on top of that. So that's the system we're going to. So what does this mean on the ground? Well, you know, if you've been unlucky enough to need the services of your GP, the pandemic has given an opportunity to trash access to your own GP. Many GPs just followed blindly what the government was telling them and erected barriers to access under the rationale of stopping the spread of COVID. Rather than taking mitigation, they pulled up the drawbridge. They've introduced IT systems, which are also a technical barrier to access. So the reputation of general practice in the eyes of patients trying to access services has massively declined. And I don't think this is any accident. So you now have practices who have a big backload of work and patients who are getting angrier and losing trust in the system. You're having a huge rise in waiting lists and hospitals struggling to keep up with elective surgery. So again, more erosion of trust and faith in the system, not only by patients on the lists, but also by the staff who can no longer provide adequate and high standard of care, and are receiving the anger of these patients who are having to wait longer and longer. So we have a perfect storm brewing. And I'll just finish with a couple of examples of what's happened to my patients. So within the last few weeks, I referred a patient who was on a 2-week pathway for suspected bowel cancer. Now, there used to be a system whereby a consultant would be nominally in charge of this patient and make sure they had the right tests, and hopefully, if all was clear, discharge them. But you had consultant overview of that person as an individual, continuity of care. But what you have now is a conveyor belt where you go for one endoscopy done by one person, you might have another endoscopy done by another person, and then you're discharged by letter. And nobody's pulling all these loose ends together and considering whether something else needs to be done. And this happened to my patient who had normal endoscopies, but continued to be unwell. And 6 months later, after another stone's weight loss, finally developed obstructive jaundice when the penny dropped that this guy had pancreatic cancer. Now, I put it to you, had there been a consultant with an overview and experience, they might have said, well, something isn't quite right, we should look further. That didn't happen. So there is certainly a dilution of experience, a trashing of continuity of care, and a conversion of a joined up system into a series of fragmented services, unconnected, and more of a process-driven service rather than a service built on delivering the highest quality of care to patients. And the final example I'll give you is of a patient who was in her late 50s. She was known to have very severe vascular disease, poor circulation to her legs, for which she had an operation. She had grafting and dilatation of these diseased blood vessels to improve the symptoms in her legs. She made her own way with her husband to an urgent care center. Now, remember, these are run by junior doctors and nurses. There's no emergency surgical backup or senior doctors are on at hand, because they're run by private companies and it's not profitable to employ experienced people. So she went to this urgent care center with extreme abdominal pain, and they couldn't make a diagnosis despite her very high risk of vascular disease. She was told to make her own way to the neighboring A&E department. Now, this is a facility that used to have an A&E, but it was downgraded. So her husband starts to drive her off to the hospital down the road, where she suddenly collapsed and started to have a serious internal bleed. Taken to the hospital. That hospital made the diagnosis of a leaking aneurysm, and then she was transferred to a third hospital where by that time she was critically ill, had emergency surgery, survived the surgery, but had a torrid time on intensive care, where she spent months only to finally die in hospital. Now, there was a 3 to 4 hour delay in the penny dropping. What was going on with this patient? I put it to you that had she been seen at a total, a functioning hospital with an A&E and surgical people on site, where the junior had free access to senior clinicians, the penny might have dropped that a lady with a history of vascular disease might have another vascular problem going on in her abdomen, and her life would have been relatively easily saved before the aneurysm popped in her abdomen. So as a doctor, I am seeing on a regular basis, there's not a week goes by where I'm seeing some failure of the service. Either the patient is suffering some harm, there's some misdiagnosis going on, or the hospital is dumping their own work onto the shoulders of general practice. Can I do follow-up blood tests for this person? Can I refer on to somebody else because they can't make the diagnosis? So even when I try to switch off, I'm confronted by the effects of what's happening to the system, a system we all have faith in, a system we've all paid our taxes to develop over the years. And our system, unfortunately, our leaders are handing over to foreign, largely tax-avoiding multinational companies who will be able to just leach out money out of the country and raid our assets and downgrade what service is left behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Sorry, I was just struggling with my mute there for a second. That was really interesting and really appreciate the amount of time you've taken. If people would like to ask Bob questions, please stick a virtual hand up or a real hand, either. Whilst people are doing that, Bob, I might just start by asking you a question myself. That's all right. So you've talked a lot of the sort of conversation around this seems to compare the current NHS, or I suppose the original model of the NHS with an American system, and that seems to be quite consistent. We see America or a socialist healthcare system. We see America, but I mean, my father lives in France. Now his healthcare since he's been there has been unbelievably good. He might have got the same in the NHS in England, I don't know, but there's absolutely no complaints about the French system. And yet that is an insurance-based system. He has to pay when he goes to the GP. It's not, it's perhaps not the system that anyone on here would ideally choose. So I just wonder, is there, and I believe the French system rates as the best in the world. I know they spend more than us, but I believe it rates the best in the world. So is there a model that they're moving towards around with privatisation that's more close to that French model, or are they just going straight for the sort of what we see in America with the very cutthroat private model that's over there?
Yeah, so I think it's useful to know there are other models out there. And what you're describing is the Bismarck model, whereby a lot of people have employment-related health insurance. But if you compare the Beveridge model to the Bismarck model, again, you're going to get more for your money if you don't create a parallel bureaucracy to run the private insurance system. So it's hugely bureaucratic. If we already have a general taxation system, but if you're creating a parallel insurance-based system where somebody has to set the charges, somebody has to decide eligibility, somebody has to collect the fees, this is a huge exercise. It's a total waste of activity. Now, you're right, the French system rates very highly. They've been investing more than us for decades. They have well-developed infrastructure. But unfortunately, the European Union has agreed something on trade deals which calls for harmonization. So it's not that we can move to their model, they are moving to the American, they're being dragged to the American model as well. And it's easier to do because they have an employer-based health system. So in fact, Simon Stevens, who's the outgoing chief executive of NHS England, in 2012, I think it was, he did a presentation for the World Economic Forum, presenting the American managed care model as the solution for healthcare for the whole of Western democracies. So there's a plan for Europe to harmonize with America. Now, if you look at who's controlling all the levers of power in this country and look at everything that's gone on before, it's America that's dominating everything, yeah? If you look at private hospital provision in this country, there's one key player, and that's Healthcare of America, Health Corporation of America, HCA. So they dominate private hospital provision in the UK. If you look at the big four accountancy firms and the people who are advising government, well, the biggest one is McKinsey. McKinsey has had a presence in the UK since the late 70s. They've been advocating for an American system all that time. McKesson is a large American IT company. So they are dominating. And one thing our group's done research on is looking who's been doing all the training around managed care, right? And the funding flows are going to a company called Optum. Optum has been paid from the research we've done, looking at contracts over a certain value, £14 million so far in training local council and healthcare leaders in the ways of managed care. Optum is a subsidiary of United Health. Yeah. So, you know, if I catch your hand in my back pocket wrapped around my wallet, I'm not going to blame somebody else for it, right? It's that clear who is taking over the NHS. It's no longer a mystery. And this is the problem is, in fact, the right-wing think tanks I've come across and been on panels against, what they deflect to is, oh, no, we're not copying America. Look at Europe, they're very happy. So it's a talking point used by the privatization lobby to distract us. So it's useful to understand it, but it's not helpful for us to make our case.
So yeah, we are heading straight towards the American sort of system.
Yeah, the bill that's in Parliament at the moment is the capstone. It's entrenching what has already been done behind the scenes. Yeah, and aided and abetted by the supposedly independent think tanks, Nuffield Trust and the King's Fund, who, guess what, on their boards have United Health people and McKinsey people. The current chair of the Nuffield Trust is a former McKinsey associate. So there's about a dozen companies who have their people or their former employees in the powerful positions across the NHS, and also these other groups that influence the public. Yeah. You know, I touched on the media. So if you look at how the BBC is run, well, you know, it's become pretty clear that the appointments being made aren't for people's talents in broadcasting or journalism. Yeah, it's a control of the narrative. And that control of the narrative extends to these think tanks, which people give a lot of credibility to. I was surprised, well, not completely surprised, but the people doing the brainwashing, there's a lot of brainwashing required, and it's quite effective because I've been subjected to some of it by the big four accountancy firms. They're the same people who advise the Labour Party, the Liberal Democratic Party, yeah? So you have this narrative wafting over our politicians, reassuring us that, you know, this is the way to go. And it's all coming from the same group. They have a total and blatant conflict of interest in the advice they're giving.
That doesn't sound hugely surprising, but thank you, Bob. Stephanie, I'll come to you and then Helen.
I was just wondering, you mentioned yourself being subjected to propaganda. Have you been approached by anyone personally as a doctor, and are doctors approached by anyone kind of like personally by representatives of these private companies to kind of sway your opinion and perhaps get you to convince other people within the NHS to head towards this kind of system? And what kind of things are they offering you as bribery, I guess, if so?
Yeah, so my closest experience to that is when I applied to stand for election as the chair of my clinical commissioning group here in Bexley. Now, I live in a very small C conservative area where on a good day I might have got one vote, which is my own, right? That's how bad things are where I live in terms of the GPs. The GPs would have been able to cast a vote whether I became the chair. I had no desire to be the chair, but I wanted to use the electoral process I wanted to use the hustings to wake my colleagues up in terms of what's going on. Because at the time we were losing services locally and we suffered the downgrading of a hospital, and there was another downgrading in the offing. So I wanted to use the platform. But what I was shocked to experience was, in order to get on the ballot, you had to go through a selection interview. And on that selection interview, I was asked a question that would I be prepared to do things that are morally repugnant if asked to do so by the board? Now that's a public body, a clinical commissioning group, asking me that question in an interview panel to get onto a ballot paper, right? Now, if that wasn't bad enough, when I wasn't selected to be on the ballot paper, there was a one candidate election. I won't tell you who won, but it doesn't take much working out. One candidate election that interview was witnessed by a supposed observer from our local medical committee who didn't say anything, didn't back me up either. So I started to say this, I'm going to make a big fuss about this. Then I was offered another job. They said, would you be prepared to do this advisory position where you attend one meeting a month and there's 10 grand in it for you? So I call that a bribe. Yeah. And I was very briefly, in an attempt to stop them trashing our diabetes services in the hospital, I briefly managed to get myself as the diabetes lead for the clinical commissioning group. And when I got there, first of all, I was treated with great respect. And within a few days, there was a conversation in a corridor where I was threatened not to rock the boat. So they're using all sorts of tactics. What has happened is the senior leadership of the NHS has been selected to do a job. And if you're not prepared to do that job and, trash services with all the consequences of that, then your face doesn't fit and you won't get in. And if you accidentally get into those positions, they'll find a way of managing you out. So the whole privatization is dependent on corruption. Because what else can you call it if you squander billions in a pointless bureaucracy and cut services at the same time? It's corrupt. There's no two ways about it. And the last thing they want is somebody with courage and integrity to have a position of power and decision making.
Thank you.
One point I failed to complete when I was doing my talk, lost track slightly, was this point about Section 75. Now, remember I said the 2012 Act brought in the statutory instrument forcing competition. and the government is now saying, well, we're going to pull this we're going to remove this section so that, because we don't believe that competition is good and whatever, right? The reason they have to remove that section 75 is that that is an obstacle for United Health gaining a monopoly hold on the control of budgets. So removing the repeal of section 75, dressed up as a step away from privatisation, will enable private sector monopoly within the NHS.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Helen, and then Valerie, I think you had your hand up as well.
I just wondered what we could do as a sort of local constituency Labour Party to sort of help expose some of this stuff. I mean, have you got a sort of a strategy really for how we could be part of that?
Yeah, I think there are things you can do at an individual level. There's things you can do within a group, but you know, the recurring theme is how there is a huge gulf between leaderships and memberships. I've experienced this very dramatically within the British Medical Association, but it's everywhere. It's even within, you know, some supposed NHS defence groups. And that's necessary, because how else could you pull off this gross betrayal of the public interest? So they know what they're doing. What they don't have on their side is the truth. And what they don't have on their side is the public's attachment to the NHS. They're still very attached to the idea of an NHS. So we have to use that. And on an individual level, if you know what's going on, we need to counter the dominant narrative that's being created on various platforms such as radio, TV, within local press, national press, because if there aren't enough voices putting the counter argument and exposing the lies and misdirection, then they win. They win the propaganda war. So we must attack from our side the propaganda war. We must engage. You know, I work full-time as a GP, and I was very easily able to get through to talk radio or LBC whenever they talked about the NHS, to put these points across. But often I was the only one who would put these points across. Then you'd get the other side putting their nonsense across about, you know, whatever they wanted to say, you know, should we be charging immigrants and all this sort of stuff, right? So we need to become an army of individual voices to engage with media as much as we can. There's a lot of amplification to be done on social media platforms, but as a Labour group, you need to convince yourself what you've heard tonight is actually what is really going on, and then push your leaders and ask them, why are they not fighting what's going on? You know, using your motions, using whatever levers of power you have, because unfortunately, what I'm hearing from the front bench does nothing to help our cause. In fact, a recent speech John Ashworth gave in Parliament was actually presenting a totally distracting talking point, which was the power grab by Matt Hancock. Yeah, he was describing the idea of a Secretary of State having control of the NHS as being ludicrous. Well, hang on a minute. That goes against what Aaron Bevan created. He, in fact, made a joke of the phrase that Bevan rose, that if a bedpan fell on a hospital ward, it should ring loudly around Westminster, saying that, you know, the politicians should be on top of any problem within the NHS. And what John Ashworth used, that was in a sort of, in a downplaying way, saying, why are you taking all this power, Matt Hancock? But actually missing the elephant in the room, which is it's not Matt Hancock's power that we're worried about. It's United Health's power that we're worried about. Why not talk about the insurance industry power grab? So, you know, I'm deeply troubled by what I am hearing and what I'm not hearing from the shadow front bench. And this is why, between us, use whatever mechanism you can. If you understand what's going on, if you understand the importance of just one thing, Section 75, which the shadow team have welcomed, the repeal of Section 75, they are welcoming it. The group Keep Our NHS Public are welcoming the repeal of Section 75. Now, even a not politically savvy child would tell you, well, if a government is so hell-bent on privatizing, why would they do one thing that might be counterproductive to privatization? It doesn't make any sense. So that is a single issue on which you can focus your concern upward. Yeah. So that you have to do what you can, but we can't give up, because if we lose the NHS, it's going to be a disaster, not for the poor and just for the poor and the elderly, because they're not the targets of this. They're just going to be allowed to die. The targets of the insurance industry is, first of all, the budget, and second of all, the top-up insurance market that will develop as the NHS declines. And the top-up insurance market is a mechanism to fleece the middle class. They just want the premiums. They don't want to pay for your sickness. And the only time you realize how bad your insurance cover is when you become seriously ill and then have to read the small print and realize your cancer treatment won't be funded over a certain value. Yeah. And that's how the American system works. The highest paid medical people in the private insurance industry in America are those doctors in charge of denying care.
Thank you, Bob. Stephanie, was it a point on that question?
I wanted to ask if you've mentioned the removal of Section 75 and that being framed as a positive thing, and given us the reasons as to why. Obviously it's not, because it can create a monopoly. Are there any other main points that people are making kind of in favour of this that we could argue against, and what would we say to them if they're kind of in favour of this privatisation and framing it as a positive thing? Is there anything else that comes up regularly that people believe to be a positive, which in fact is a negative, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think what people are falling for is the narrative about these reforms are building on the lessons of the pandemic. That's completely false. The use of the word integration is deceptive. What they're trying to integrate is what's left of social care budgets with NHS budgets. So there's a bigger pot of money to siphon money away out of. That's the only integration that they're interested in. The misdirection, focusing on the control of the Secretary of State rather than talking about the insurance industry, that's another big problem. But there aren't many rational people who know what's going on, who think there's anything beneficial in this act. You've got idiots and propagandists and people who are ideologically wedded to this transition to the American system. So I haven't come across any sensible person saying this is a good thing. Maybe I mix in.
Sorry, I was thinking kind of like more the general public who are perhaps a little less aware of what's going on and a bit kind of more influenced by what's being framed as like something positive. But I think that's really, really useful to know about the terms that are being used to frame this as a positive thing.
Yes, the integration is a very, very powerful word. Who can argue against it? But we need to use some other slogans they came out with. Well, take back control was quite an effective slogan. But what they're doing is giving control over to American corporations. So you need to say, this is not integration. This is giving control over to foreign corporations to suck out wealth out of the nation. This is a traitorous act. This is going to kill tens of thousands of people every year, preventably. This is not taking back control. This is giving away control. So we have to replace their words with our own, because if they have spent decades disintegrating the system, this is not about integration. The other thing to say is build on people's personal experience. So when they say, oh, the local hospital services are rubbish, I'm waiting so long, I can't get a GP appointment, you have to explain the decade-long defunding and the misdirection of money. And the test and trace system is a very current and very potent example of what they've done. They've directed billions and had a very catastrophic outcome. We've had the most expensive response and the worst response in the world. What better example do you want of the intent of this government?
Thank you, Bob. Valerie.
Hi, thank you, Bob. That's really very interesting and really sobering, actually. I worked for the health service for a long time, and I remember when I was a speech and language therapist, and when I was training, we were studying the showing my age here, but we were studying the purchase of provider split, and then I lived it. And the thing that I wrote down when you were speaking was fragmentation complete. Just that's what struck me. And I wondered whether there's been response yet, or maybe there's not enough information, because from the professional bodies, so not just the BMA and nurses bodies, but sort of all the professions allied to medicine, because that's the NHS will no longer be the provider of health services. I think might hit home to people a little bit more real, as a bit of a real threat to them. It's really quite terrifying, actually. It's like a process that we've seen in the health service for, as you say, for a long time. And I don't think it's any accident that just at the time when everyone's on their knees in a pandemic is when you have this massive this massive reform. It's real opportunism. But I wondered I was going to ask, what can we do? But, how have professional bodies responded? I'm thinking of continuing professional development, of training, of professional standards of care. It seems so fragmented and localized. How is that going to fit together?
All right, so I don't know if you saw in the Telegraph this weekend, a colleague of mine has done quite an extensive freedom of information around the sort of pandemic response and the exercise Cygnus 2016. Okay. So this is an example of how bad our representative bodies are. The British Medical Association was in talks with NHS England not on how to build up capacity and prepare for a pandemic, but on how to have a system where we denied care to people over the age of 70.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So our representative body was quite happy with the demise of thousands of people, rather than making this public and saying, God help us with this government, we need to prepare for the pandemic. They were negotiating a way to get the profession to go along with selective access to ITU. If you look at the white paper, it's online. The final few pages list the bodies that have signed up to the white paper. That includes the Royal Medical Colleges, the RCN, the BMA, and Unison, the biggest health union. Now, without any shame, the BMA recently put out a statement that they object to the bill. So they signed up to the white paper, but they're objecting to the bill. But if you read this statement, it doesn't object to the idea of commissioning. It doesn't object to the creation of these new legal entities. But what it does argue for is a few medical snouts at the trough. Can we have more medics on the boards? So they've given away the principle of fighting against the bill, right? and they were totally signed up to the bill. The BMA actively sabotaged their own industrial action, the junior doctor industrial action, which could have been a key turning point, actually. They sabotaged it in 2016, where you had all these doctors who knew that this new contract was a severe downgrading and would lead to a brain drain, right? The BMA pulled the rug, despite 2 ballots against the contract. They proposed ludicrous industrial action, which broke the unity amongst the junior doctors, and then there was silence, radio silence for over a year. And in 2019, that contract quietly slipped through, but using the votes of medical students. Yeah. So the other big threat with privatization is downskilling, downskilling and task shifting. Part of the bill talks about removing regulations which mean you have to be qualified to deliver healthcare. That's just another bonus, right? So the plan is to replace doctors with nurses, to replace nurses with healthcare assistants. It's a race to the bottom, and you can see, you know, it's pretty obvious what the patient safety implications will be. But don't worry, because they're setting up a new secretive patient safety body, which, because they want to protect identity of the employees, won't be done in public. So they're going to set up a secret safety panel. They're going to deregulate the professions on top of all the other things I've listed. And the medical bodies, to our collective shame, have signed up to all of this, although they take a totally ludicrous and cynical public position, which is contrary to what they've signed up to, right? So they're being duplicitous, to say the least. And again, if more of the members wake up to what's going on, they need to ask serious questions of their leaders, yeah, who are leading us down, you know, off the edge of a cliff. Now you've got to ask yourself, why would they do this? Well, either they're ideologically aligned, or it's for personal career progression, or they want some sort of gong at the end of it. Yeah. People leading us are doing it for some other reason. They're not doing it because they want to lead the profession. Yeah, they're quite happy, you know, for medical staff not to have PPE. They're quite happy for the government to cut down beds and run on a overstretched workforce with obvious implications. You know what? There's one key case I can draw to your attention: the case of Dr. Chris Day, who was a whistleblower, complaining about lack of staff on his IT intensive care unit, which led to preventable patient death. And the BMA threw him under a bus rather than supporting him in an employment tribunal. Now, belatedly, they've come to support him 5 years after the event, right? But his case was in the news during the junior doctor dispute. Yeah. Why they didn't tie these two things together, the only explanation is they didn't want to win. So, yeah, members need to put pressures on their leaders at every level within every organization. Our other problem is the charities. More and more services are being handed over to the third sector, to charities, and charities are increasingly dependent on government contracts. So they've introduced a financial disincentive for charities to speak freely and fairly about what's going on.
Thank you, Bob. I think we've seen that in other places as well, so that's concerning. Okay, any more questions from anybody? Oh, Linda, sorry, go for it.
Yes, I think
You've presented a very depressing picture, I have to say, and it feels like we've got a massive fight on our hands. I was saying earlier, I did write to my MP about the bill, and one of the things he came back with, and one of the things that we always hear from the government, is that they guarantee that the NHS will always provide care free at the point of delivery, regardless of ability to pay. And that really is all that people want to hear. And once they hear that, they're reassured. And it's very hard to challenge that when we're not paying at the moment. It's something in the future. So how would you address that?
That's a great one. And I always forget to mention it. So thanks for reminding me. Private health insurance is free at the point of use. The NHS, what's left of it will be free at the point of use, but the integrated care boards will salami slice away what services are available. Yeah, so they don't say in that reassuring line that the NHS will remain comprehensive or universal. Well, we know it's not universal because immigrants are facing charges, right? Now, once you have a charging system, which costs more, the infrastructure costs more than the amount you're bringing in charges, you either got to say whoever's doing this is economically illiterate, or there's some other agenda. And the other agenda is to extend charges to everyone, right? So if your integrated care board decides we are no longer offering cataract surgery, but you can pay. Yeah. So your NHS services will be free at the point of use, but these are no longer NHS services. Yeah. So then you pay. So, you know, they're using that line, but it's deceptive. And these crooks will never come out with the truth. They will declare their innocence even behind bars forever, right? What was that Jonathan Aitken line? The sword of truth and the shield of honor, or whatever it was, before he got locked up. So do not expect any truth from these guys. What they're relying on, it's another thing that struck me, is why do we fall for all of this, right? There's something within group psychology. We are pre-programmed as human beings, as a species, to trust our leaders. Because if we didn't, we would have died off as cavemen and women. So we chose leaders who were strong and good at hunting, right? To make sure we had food on the table, yeah? If we didn't follow our leaders, who were leaders because they were experienced and good hunters, the tribe would die off. So there was an evolutionary advantage to trusting our leaders. The problem arises when you get malign leaders who don't get there on merit. And that's what you have is our political system. So they use that innate psychological Achilles heel to keep pulling the wool over our eyes. Yeah, that's the problem. And none of us, when I tell you a massive lie, there's another psychological trick we play on ourselves. If, Linda, I told you a blatant lie, but I told it so convincingly and so confidently, there's part of you which thinks there might be some truth in it, because the other alternative is that I have utter contempt for you. And that means having to swallow some self-respect, diminish your own self-respect. So what we end up doing is falling for the lie, because to be lied to so blatantly is quite painful and disrespectful. Yeah. So these are psychological issues which are used against us, and you know, under pressure people do bad things. So you might go into an NHS leadership position being a good person, but after a while, if all this directive coming from the top, if the organizational ethos has changed, you're going to go along with it. If your income depends on towing the line, 99% of us are going to toe the line. Mm-hmm. And there was another experiment done in the 70s in terms, I don't know if you've heard of the Milgram experiment, where they test, you know, he was looking into how did Germany end up doing what they did, you know, with the extermination program. you know, is there something unique about Germans? No, there isn't. There's something about us which programs us to listen to authority figures. And when volunteers with the Milgram experiment were told to give people potentially fatal electric shocks, 70% of them went along with it. Yeah. So we're looking for that 30% of more independent thinkers to help us get the truth out.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you again for that, Bob. Helen, again.
I just wanted to raise in the, I mean, I might have remembered it wrong, but in the 2019 general election campaign, they tried really hard, the Labour leadership tried really hard to you know, get the electorate to understand what was happening to the NHS, and they had and nobody seemed to believe them. So what do we do about it? I mean, it's sort of same kind of thing. And what do we do about this mass kind of unwillingness to believe that this is actually happening? And, you know, Boris is a good guy. He wouldn't do that. You know, he's a bit of a clown, but actually he wouldn't do that. And, you know, it's so difficult to fight against that sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah. See, I don't think, and a lot of stuff I've read, I don't think people voted for the NHS in 2019. They voted about Brexit, unfortunately. And, you know, though, you know, the Brexit vote you could argue about, but I think going back on the 2017 position destroyed a lot of trust across the board. Yeah, you know, so what we were hearing about the NHS was valid, but it wasn't the strongest argument. You know, talking about the trade deal, people don't understand trade deals. Yeah. There were much clearer arguments to be made that weren't made. But I think most people were focused on feeling betrayed that their vote wasn't respected from whenever the vote was, 2016 or whenever. Yeah, that was the biggest issue. And people thought, you know, why they wanted to stick one up on the establishment. And, you know, the vote for Trump wasn't that Trump was a great guy. They were just fed up of being lied to by the Democrats and getting a candidate they didn't want imposed on them. You know, so people get so angry sometimes they shoot themselves in the foot, and that's what's happened.
Yeah.
But, you know, we things have moved on. We've had a catastrophic government that has, you know, led to over 100,000 preventable deaths. Yeah. Yeah. We need to tie that up with an understanding of what's happening to the health service, you know. But it needs to be made by people who are trusted. And unfortunately, trust in our political leaders is at an all-time low.
Thank you, Bob. And thank you, Helen. Any other questions for Bob before I maybe sneak in one before the end? Excellent. Oh, I'll come back. Go on, Stephanie.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask, I guess, how do you see the reversal of all this happening? So how can we like reverse all of these changes to get back to where we were and what we all want the NHS to be, which is the provider of these services?
Yeah, I think the priority is to do what we can to stop this bill becoming law. We have a short time window in which to do that. If we can prevent that, it will be a lot easier to renationalize the NHS. But once you have multinational corporations granted access to budgets without challenge, it becomes very difficult and potentially very expensive. So, you know, stop the bill and renationalize. And explain renationalize means provision. Provision is key because by being a provider, you can control the quality of the service, the quality of the staff you employ, and then the responsibility lays within democratic mechanisms. So that is the key. Provision, you know, and you know, whatever public service people work in, it would be education, be it the prison service, be it the police. all of these services have experienced the same mechanism of undermining, defunding, de-skilling, and alienation of the staff. So that's quite a significant proportion of the population who all of this resonates with. And fundamentally, I think it's time for us to mobilize on the streets, civil disobedience, peaceful protest as much as we can, and to expose the lies and the destination, and make unions with American campaigners who are fighting these very same rapacious corporations. They should be able to tell us what we have in store should we fail to fight them off.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, anyone else? No, excellent. The only thing I was going to ask Bob is, can you guide us towards the best places to stay up to date with the campaign groups that we can join, individuals that we can follow, that sort of thing? Is there a sort of 3 or 4 people or directions you can guide us?
In terms of understanding a bit more where we are and where we're going, there's 2 books I would recommend. One is The Plot Against the NHS by Colin Lees and Stuart Player. That outlines very much how we got to 2012. Another book is called Deadly Spin, written by a former American insurance industry executive who saw the light, and he sets out how the American medical industrial complex works, and in a really clear and passionate way. That's written by Wendell Potter. So if there are 2 books you're going to read, those are top of the list. I'd certainly recommend everybody watch Sicko by Michael Moore, which is a 2007 documentary, which doesn't even look at the uninsured. It looks at the people with insurance and how badly they are treated, because that's where we're heading. So those 3 resources are crucial. You can imagine there's a lot of misdirection and misinformation even within NHS defense organizations, right? There's one group I would recommend. It's called Every Doctor, who seem committed to fighting privatisation and don't pull their punches. So they're on, they're a membership organisation and they're on social media. So Every Doctor's one. The NHS Support Federation is an online resource. They do a lot of good stuff. In terms of patient data, there's been this data grab, which is currently going on. A group called Med Confidential have done a lot of good work raising the issue of protecting confidentiality with patient data and careful use of patient data. I think they're the best places to go. I have big problems with Keep Our NHS Public through not only their messaging, but also how they've conducted themselves, in particular, being undemocratic and not having very sort of shadowy processes, let's put it that way, which I've personally experienced. And their biggest problem at the moment is their stance on Section 75, which is totally counterproductive. So if you want to read something counterproductive just for balance, have a look what they say about Section 75. I've also got a website which goes along with the film, thegreatnhsheist.com, and there's quite a few blogs on there with references which talks about Section 75 primary care networks, which is this new contract which will destroy general practice, bring them into your GP just being another employer of these integrated care boards. So there's quite a few resources out there, and I'm working with a group which is going to hopefully launch in the next month or so, but I can let you know more about that when it's a bit more concrete.
Okay, that was really helpful. Thank you, Bob. And I'll look at a lot of that stuff. Okay, I'm going to thank Bob for his contribution tonight. It's been really enlightening, and there's a lot for us to take away, and I'm sure those issues will be appearing in our personal lives and at future CLP meetings and bits and pieces. Unless anyone else has any contribution, I think a quick round of applause, be it visual, for Bob. And yeah, thank you very much.
Could I leave you on a positive note?
Absolutely.
Please.
So throughout history, change didn't come from the top. So we shouldn't wait for change at the top. And it only takes a small percentage of committed, courageous, well-informed people to change history. And that's the people we need to find and connect with. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Bob. And thank you everybody else for coming. It's been really interesting.